My name is Kathy Ford, and I'm with the North County chapter of Amnesty International, your host tonight. And I want to really thank Hans and the Wavelength Brewing Company for allowing us to gather on this occasion tonight. Thank you. I also want to mention a lot of these young folks that are here tonight are from Rancho Buena Vista High School. A lot of them are in the amazing high school Amnesty International Club, one of the best clubs in the country. First, I want to tell you just a little who we are. Amnesty International was founded in London in 1961, and it has grown into the largest grassroots movement ever known and the largest human rights movement around the world. It started with just a few people in a meeting, and now there are more than 6 million volunteers and supporters around the world. We're one of just thousands of volunteer community groups around the world. And what we do, we're impartial, we're nonprofit, we're not tied to a government or a religion. What we do is we work committedly for the same standard of human rights, for the protection of people around the world who are imprisoned or silenced or killed because of their peaceful expression of their beliefs. And we work to end the torture, to open the prison doors, to have fair and prompt trials for political prisoners. And we do that impartially. It doesn't matter where you are. If your government is taking away the basic human rights that were laid out by the world in the United Nations in 1948, they all signed it and said, we have certain basic human rights that are guaranteed. There are certain things your government can't do to you. And that's what our mandate comes from. I also want to just invite anybody who wants to find out more about our group. We meet here in San Marcos twice a month. We'd love for you to come by anytime and find out. You can go to our Facebook page and find out a little more or talk with us tonight about the group. We're here for Muhammad Abu Zaid, who was a photojournalist, also known as Shakan in Egypt, 3 years ago, covering as a journalist a peaceful sit-in demonstration. That day, 1,000 people were killed in demonstrations throughout the country. When they found out he was a journalist, he was arrested, and more than 3 years later, he is still in detention. We're here today for Erin Keskin. She's the editor-in-chief of a Kurdish daily newspaper in Turkey. She's been dragged into the courts and arrested more than 100 times. Her home has been invaded and ransacked by police. Her newspaper has been closed. We're here today for the family of Prageet Ekno-Lagoda in Sri Lanka, a journalist and a political cartoonist who is doing what we do practically every day. He's driving home, chatting on the phone with a friend when the phone goes dead. It was a couple days before the election. He was investigating some military weapons that were used during the Civil War. He had come out in favor of the opposition candidate. He was officially disappeared. His wife and his 2 sons have never seen him since. Our group adopted Prageet. There are petitions going around, there are letters for him. We now know that he was abducted by the military. He was taken to barracks for a couple weeks and murdered, and his body dumped in the ocean. So because journalists risk their lives, endure intimidation, harassment, are sent into exile, are arrested, put in prison, and killed for trying to bring to us the news and opinion. Bloggers, members of the media, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, in the last 25 years, more than 1,200 members of the media have been killed. Last year, 259 were put in prison around the world. 48 were killed. Another in Pakistan who was just bludgeoned to death last month by a mob because of his blog was considered to be blasphemous. These are brave people that put themselves out there to bring us the truth. We have one of them tonight to speak with us. and they need to be protected, and they need our help, and I hope you'll be willing to help tonight. We think of this as happening over there. A free and independent media is important for any society, for any civil society, and it doesn't just happen over there. 2 months ago, a journalist who was covering the protests at Standing Rock was arrested. She was doing her professional duty as a journalist, put into a cage for 30 hours, and now faces charges of trespassing for trying to cover the story. These are brave souls that are out there every day trying to bring us information and opinion through a variety of media. And in our own country, our president calls the media the enemy of the American people. And if you're so inclined, you'll have an opportunity to address that tonight as well. I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you get a lot out of the program, and I hope you'll write a few letters. We know it works. We hear from the people we write letters for that get freed or get protection. We know international pressure works.
Thank you all. Thank you to Amnesty International and all of you for having me here. It's an honor. I am the fronteras reporter at KPBS. Before, I was a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswires in Mexico City, covering the rural sector in Mexico, Central America, and the Andean region. So I've basically, from the moment that I graduated college, I've been drawn to covering Mexico, partly because my dad is from there, which is what my book's about, but also just because I grew up on the border, and it's a country that's always fascinated me. And as I'm sure you all know, Mexico is one of the most dangerous places to be a journalist right now. At least 104 journalists have been murdered in Mexico since the year 2000, and 25 have been disappeared. That's what they call it when people go missing, and it's most likely that they've been kidnapped and killed. So it is definitely the most dangerous place for journalists in the Western Hemisphere. The New York Times recently put out an article talking about this issue. And the death threats more commonly come from officials, actually, from government authorities than from the drug cartels, which I think is something that people in the United States don't necessarily think about or realize, the fact that there is so much impunity and corruption in the government. And that is a large part of the reason there are so many deaths, because whether it's the officials or the cartels who want to go after the journalists and silence them and make sure that information doesn't get out, they know that they can get away with it because of the fact that the justice system is very, very broken. I have received a death threat, luckily just one, and it was, I believe, more because I gave my business card to the wrong person. Not so much because of something that I reported, although I do know that a lot of my articles have made people angry. So one of the first stories that involved kind of putting myself at risk was for the Wall Street Journal. I was covering the fact that opium poppy producers were switching to coffee production instead of opium poppy production because they were sick of dealing with the cartels, and coffee prices were really, really high. They were at an near record high that year. So I went to the plantations to go talk to these producers. I told them I wasn't going to identify the town by name and that I wouldn't identify them by name, and so they welcomed me. And while I was there, having dinner with the government official who had organized everything, all of a sudden one of the producers ran in completely out of breath saying, "You guys need to leave. You need to leave now. 17 armed men from a neighboring town, which I won't name, are on their way here." And apparently this neighboring town was working with the cartels, and they didn't want these producers to stop producing opium poppies. And so they were apparently coming for the official who was leading this effort. And so we had to run. We got into the bed of a truck, and it sped us down this dirt road. And I was back. I mean, I was a very young journalist. It was my first year as a journalist, and so I honestly still thought I was invincible back then. So I wasn't that scared. And I took a lot of risks back then that I would never take now because I realized that I'm not invincible. None of us are. And so it's so important now to be prepared, and thankfully KPBS has been paying, because they know how dangerous Mexico has gotten. They've equipped us with hostile environment awareness training. Now we have protocols in place so that when I'm going to be going to Mexico, I give a list. When it's going to be a dangerous assignment, I give a list of exactly who I'm going to be talking to, who I'm going to be with, in what locations, at exactly what time, and also just having check-in protocols where I'm like every 2 hours or every 3 hours letting my editor know that I'm okay, so they know if they have to, like, I don't know, call the police. And for me, I feel like it's this great responsibility and a great opportunity to cover Mexico. This award-winning Mexican journalist named Marcela Turati, she came to San Diego to give a talk saying, you know, it's the responsibility, or she didn't say it was the responsibility, but she challenged U.S. journalists to expose the issues in Mexico that Mexican journalists are unable to expose because of the fact that they run such greater risks and have less funding, and just their lives are way more in danger than U.S. journalists. I mean, as a U.S. journalist, we're not invulnerable, but we definitely are, for some reason, our lives are respected more in Mexico. I mean, it's terrible to say, but that is the case, and so they're more likely to leave me alone than a Mexican journalist who's covering the same story. So I do feel like this responsibility as a U.S. journalist to expose these issues. And not just what's happening in Mexico, but also how a lot of the problems in Mexico are linked to the U.S., you know, through money laundering, through the drug consumption that goes on here. And the one story that I think really hasn't been sufficiently told, and which I am very interested in finding a way to tell, is the capital flows that are going into the U.S. People assume that the cartel money is all, you know, going to Mexico, but actually there's a lot of it that stays in the United States, and that's not an issue that's covered. Obviously, like we were talking about earlier, you know, journalism is fundamental for a democracy to work. You know, we hold governments accountable. We allow the public to make informed decisions in politics, in healthcare, in, you know, a variety of different aspects of their lives. And when that system, when journalists can't do their jobs for whatever reason, when they're not allowed to tell their jobs, then that system becomes very, very broken, and it's hard for a country to progress in favor of the people. For example, in Mexico, one of the most famous journalists, Carmen Aristegui, she was fired from her radio show after exposing that the president, Enrique Peña Nieto, lived in a $7 million mansion that seemed to have been gifted to him from a government contractor. And then another journalist, Ruben Espinosa, he took an unflattering photo of a governor in Veracruz, Duarte, who was very well known to be going after journalists who were telling stories of his corruption. And Ruben started to receive many death threats, so he went to Mexico City, which was supposed to be a safe haven for journalists. When I was living in Mexico City, I always believed, and people always talked about how, you know, we're in a safe zone. Mexico City's safe. But he was found killed in Mexico City. They followed him to Mexico City. So it's getting worse. And so I just feel like the responsibility is even greater for people who are here in the U.S. I mean, when you go out there and you put your life at risk, which, by the way, I try not to put my life at risk anymore, unless it's for a very important story, and unless I am very prepared. And I've taken all the precautions necessary. I went into the sewers of Tijuana. I ran across Tijuana's busiest highways. But I really do believe that this story was the story that needed to be told. It wasn't being told by anybody else. And the same evening that NewsHour ran it, the Tijuana police chief was asked to resign. I don't know if it was connected to my story, because the next day, the police chief wrote, I blame a perverse media campaign for my resignation. And I called up the mayor. I was like, is this because of me? And the mayor wouldn't say. So I couldn't get confirmation. So the shots in the dark with the migrant who had been run over by a car, it was a very hard decision to make, to go into the canal at night. I was supposed to go with a trusted source. I'd been networking with my sources and trying to figure out who I could trust, who I couldn't trust for months, almost a year before I decided to go in. And my source who was supposed to take me into the canal at night didn't show up, but we'd already paid a videographer, and I had a security consultant with me. So we were thinking, well, what do we do? What do we do? And I knew that there was this section of the canal where a lot of migrants, deported migrants, hung out, which I'd previously been told to stay away from because a lot of these did use drugs. But we decided to go onto a bridge over the canal and try to establish communications with them and from the safety of the bridge. And then once we kind of were talking back and forth, and we decided that, well, they told us, there's something down here that you need to see. And that's when we decided to cross. I obviously wouldn't have done that if I didn't have a security consultant with me. But these are the kinds of stories that I feel blessed to be able to tell. And unfortunately, journalists in Mexico aren't able to tell them always. They don't feel safe. If they aren't safe, they are killed. And so I feel very honored, and I thank you all for taking an interest in the work that we do, because it really means a lot and just validates a lot of what we do. So thank you.
So how can we hold the foreign governments accountable when we are starting to see the same kind of scrutiny, judgment, and righteous attacks on our own domestic media? This is John Adams. The liberty of the press is essential to the security of freedom, and that is what this day is about. And this is what our media needs to be protected. So tonight we thought, yes, Amnesty International usually traditionally works to hold accountable foreign governments, foreign dictators especially, trying to improve the condition, the quality of life, and the prisoners, the journalists, and try to uncover all these crimes against the press and against the prisoners of conscience. So we thought we can't ignore the fact that we have to be vigilant and we have to act on our own government as well and keep our government accountable and have an action, something that we can do to make our voices heard. So be alert, be informed, and be active.